Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be with you guys this morning. I can't wait to get back to church. Looking forward to it. Been home longer than I ever have been home, and so I'm looking forward to getting back to church. I know I'm going to hear some smack talk from Tommy and Joey for my background here. So my apologies to the Burns family as a whole for making you see this beautiful Cubs logo behind me. Maybe even Jeff Reese. No. I know Jeff's a big Reds fan, so I am sorry about that. This may be a distraction for you. But excited to be with you guys this morning and share from Matthew 13. Excited to be able to share this with everybody. It's really an awesome passage of Scripture. And really, there's no doubt this should encourage us during this time. A lot of uncertainty. Humanly speaking, over human history, maybe this isn't obviously that huge of a problem that we're all dealing with, but in our own lives, it's dealing with each one of us individually, and it's a test for us. And so, in a lot of ways, I feel like, as I was studying this passage, I feel like I can relate to the disciples in some ways, in that obviously I can relate to disciples in a lot of ways, but in one way, particularly this passage, is they felt like they had an understanding of what the kingdom of heaven meant or looked like, and they really didn't. Their assumptions were off what they believed, and so Matthew 13 was really, a lot of people have said, different commentaries said that it was Jesus' attempt to walk them through what the kingdom of heaven really looked like here. And so a lot of times in my life, I feel like I have an understanding of something or assumption of something, and it's just totally off. And God uses His Word in different circumstances to help redirect my thinking. And so, excited to be able to walk through this chapter with you guys this morning. So let's think about, for a second, where the disciples' minds could have been, okay? Obviously, we've been studying Matthew up to this point. It's been really good. I think there was probably some questions coming up in the disciples' minds that they may or may not have fully understood what was going on. But let's think about it. So one of the questions that could have been coming up was, if Jesus was the Messiah King, why was there so much opposition? They had an understanding or an assumption that the Messiah would come and obviously be more of a political power and overthrow their persecution and things like that, and that wasn't happening. They believed Jesus was the Messiah, but why was there so much opposition? If Jesus was the Messiah, why did the religious leaders not get it? Why weren't they getting it? You could see those questions in their minds. Why were not more and more people following His message and believing it? And, why was there opposition? And really simply put, if Jesus was the king, if Jesus was the Messiah King, where's the kingdom? Where is it at? This wasn't exactly what we were thinking, but we do believe He's the Messiah. So you can see these being legit questions in the disciples' hearts and minds as we're progressing through this. So Matthew 13, Jesus would really help His followers and people listening and His disciples by telling them stories. With the one added twist, they were actually parables. And so most of you guys and all of us that grew up in church are familiar with parables, but if for some reason you're listening out there and you're not sure what a parable is essentially a comparison between two things. But the listeners, whoever's listening, would be very familiar with one. And then whoever's speaking would compare something they're familiar with something they're unfamiliar with. And so that would give them an understanding about whatever they're unfamiliar with by understanding what they're familiar with. So that's what Jesus did in Matthew 13. He shared a lot of different parables. And what's neat about parables is the people who believe and the true listeners would understand. The people who don't believe wouldn't get it. And so So anticipating Christ's coming death, his resurrection and ascension, Matthew 13 deals with the question, what will happen to the kingdom when the rejected king goes back to heaven without actually ruling over the earth? So, good question. So to answer this question, let's jump in first to verse 11 of Matthew 13. Jesus basically used the word mystery or secrets, that he's going to reveal to them a mystery hidden since the creation of the world. Actually says that in verse 13:35. But which is cool. And so the Bible, basically a secret or a mystery, refers to a truth that was never revealed in the Old Testament. So he's revealing something new to his followers, but now it's made plain now here in this passage. So the Old Testament has revealed the earthly reign of Christ on the throne of David, but Matthew 13 introduces a different form of the kingdom, the spiritual reign of the king while he is physically absent before his second coming. So that is the mystery, the subject of Matthew 13. It's just awesome stuff. And so we're going to be able to dive into that a little bit this morning. So let's look at, so he starts out, the kingdom is for listeners only. So Jesus shares the parable of the sower, which we're going to get into in a second. But after he shares it, first off, Jesus, the setting is the crowd's pressing in. He actually jumps onto a boat and starts teaching from the boat. So he shares the parable of the sower, which we'll get into in a second. But the disciples come to him and says, why are you speaking to them in parables? And they say that in verses 10. So let's jump in there, verse 10. It says, and the disciples came to him and said, why do you speak to them in parables? And Jesus said, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, you will keep on hearing, but you will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but you will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull with their ears, and they scarcely hear. Talking about the children of Israel here. And they have closed their eyes, otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them. So it's really a call out to the children of Israel. They had a voluntary closing of their ears and eyes. But then in contrast, which is cool, verse 16 and 17, look at that. In contrast with the disciples' eyes and ears were open and accepting God's message. So look at verse 16, he says, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. So basically, the disciples should have just been amped at that point. They are seeing things, and things are being revealed to them that many men in ages past would have loved to have seen or experienced, because they truly believed and accepted God's message. So he quickly calls out the children of Israel for their unbelief and not accepting the message. So Jesus really explains the parable of the sower, so it makes it easy. But let's read that real quick. So it goes back to verse 3, and he says, behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell in rocky places, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. So then the sower is explained starting in verse 18. So Jesus said, Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. That's the first seed. This is the one whom seed was sown beside the road. The one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word, immediately receives it with joy, yet has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And the one of whom seed was sown among thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100, some 60, some 30. So Jesus then explains the parable of the sower. And so the seed is obviously the good news of the kingdom. Jesus says that. And we have to always remember there's nothing wrong with the seed or the sower. In this parable, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the seed of the sower. The soil is always the issue. It's us. The soil is always the issue. And so really, it's good for all of us as we go through this, really to think about our life. What is my life? Test your soil, as someone said when I was studying this. Test your soil. Which one are you? Even if you're clearly saved, the process of evaluation can prove helpful to diagnose unhealthiness in our hearts. Because obviously we're sinners, and it's good evaluation. So the first soil was a hard soil, hardened by traffic. This person is who chooses not to understand. This person may understand Jesus' teaching in a literal sense, but refuses to accept it. Even in Matthew 21, later, 45, the Bible says the chief priests and the Pharisees, they knew what Jesus was teaching. They knew what he was saying, but they refused to accept his truth. This is that soil. Many people who were exposed to the word and works of Christ fell into this category. They rejected him without any second thought. So the second soil is the rocky soil. Initially, this person, their response is unreserved, emotional, but only because the circumstances are favorable. The cost of commitment is not obvious. Okay, this person quickly defects from the word or the message when it gets difficult. Questions can arise. Was this person truly saved? And this really can't be answered from Jesus' words here because that wasn't the purpose. But it is doubtful this person was expressing true faith from the start. So, will you persevere? Rocky soil is someone who made a profession, but there's no perseverance following that up. The third soil is thorns. Again, there's initial growth here as well in this person, but the influence of other idols, worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, deceitfulness of a lot of things, pulls this person away. He's not driven away by hardship necessarily, but is lured away from the truth of something better. There's something better in this life. And honestly, if we think about it, we know plenty of people that are probably in that second soil or third soil. That they've rejected Christ. Eventually they've rejected Christ because, there's something better out there and they're struggling to find it. So we've already seen in Matthew 8, example of that person who started following Jesus, but then began to make excuses for all these different things of why he couldn't commit. And so this is that person, the person that is choked up by the world, really. And then you have the fourth soil is the good soil. This is the person who hears the truth, understands it, and accepts the truth. And really, I would say this, they accept as the most important thing in their life. That at this point, this person, this is the most prized thing in their life. And that's the good soil. I'll add that, and I read this somewhere, I don't think Jesus is telling this parable just to diagnose the crowds. Even though if you listen to this, you're going to fall into one of these categories, most likely. But I believe Jesus is telling this parable to teach his disciples as well about the ministry of sowing the seeds. Okay? So And the key here is, like I said a few minutes ago, trust the seed. Okay, we can't alter the message. There's such a temptation to alter the message. Obviously, this is something that we all appreciate about Pastor Mike, because it's very clear that he is not about altering the message. We must not think there's anything wrong with the sower or the seed. The sower and the seed, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. We're so tempted sometimes to assume that because people aren't changing or changing at the pace that we would like it, that we've got to like maybe tweak the message a little bit, or because we have to kind of make something happen, and that's just not the truth. Obviously, we see in this situation there's 4 soils, only 3 of them truly understand and accept the truth. So that's a lot of people that have missed it. I read a cool quote from a guy named Archibald Brown. He's a contemporary of Spurgeon. Listen to this quote, I'll read it. He says, "I do not find that there was any attempt to increase a diminished congregation by resorting to something more pleasant. I do not hear Jesus saying, 'We must keep our gatherings anyway, so run after those friends, Peter, and tell them that we will have a different style of service tomorrow, something very short and attractive with little, if any, preaching. Today was a service for God, but tomorrow we will have a pleasant evening for the people. Tell them they will sure to enjoy it, and we will have a happy hour. Be quick, Peter, we must get these people somehow, if not by the gospel, then by some nonsense.'" No. Brown goes on to say, "Jesus pitied sinners. He pleaded with them, sighed over them, and warned them, and wept over them, but he never sought to amuse them. We must sow and pray and leave the results to him." And in one sense, that's so encouraging, because it's not up to us whether someone chooses to believe and accept. We have the responsibility, or we are commanded to share our faith and to share it with those around us. But it's not our responsibility to somehow make them see and understand the truth. That is the soil, and we can trust the message. We can trust the seed and the sower. And so I would just ask, where are you at in those soils? At this point, I would assume that if you're watching this at 8:45 on a Sunday morning from your home, then you've obviously understood the truth, accepted it, and it's always good to ask ourselves where we're at. So the next parable, tares among the wheat. Okay, so let's keep going on. Verse 24, Jesus gives another parable. I don't know, I'm going through these pretty quick, but it's a lot here. Tares among the wheat. Let's just read that. So verse 24 of Matthew 13, Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No. For while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" So the first thing we learned is the kingdom is for listeners only. We learned that through the parable of the sowers. The kingdom is for those who only listen, hear, and understand and accept the truth. The second one we just learned is the parable of tares is the kingdom. We learned that the faithful must coexist with evil until judgment. Okay, and so again, this should be encouraging to us to understand this, because not that we don't know this, but there can be a time that we get disappointed. We don't understand why in this life the evil sometimes seem to be so successful, get so many things. Jesus tells them here that the evil, the tares, are going to stay with the wheat until the end of judgment. So take hope in that, rest in that. Here's the key. Here's what we can rest in. We know the final score. okay? We know the final score at the end, and so we can rest in that. And I have kind of a funny thing that happened to me over quarantine, and this was before I was even studying for this. Some of you may or may not know, but I'm a pretty relatively big tennis fan, and I like to play tennis, but I really love Roger Federer. I've loved Roger Federer since probably 2004, 2005. I was actually just finishing up high school at the time, and I've watched Roger for a long time. And back in 2017, he was playing the Australian Open, which is a big tournament, that's a major tournament, one of the big four tournaments every year. And Roger was about 35 years old. He was getting older, hadn't won in 2 or 3 years, and had some injuries. And he had made it to the final match of the Australian Open. Now that match starts at like 2 or 3 a.m. So of course, I'm up watching it, and I just remember that match being so intense. He was playing Rafael Nadal, and it was just such an intense match. And I was like, and Jenny rolls her eyes at me. She wasn't awake at that time, but she usually rolls her eyes at me if I'm getting really intense into a game or a sport. But I just can't help it. So I was into the match. It was in the 5th set. It was just back and forth, back and forth. And honestly, Roger looked like he was going to lose. He was down 3-1 in the 5th set, and I just remember being just annoyed. I was like, oh, my goodness, he's so close. He blew opportunities. Roger ends up coming back to win. Okay, so he won the Australian Open. I was happy. Well, that match during quarantine, they've been replaying all these old matches. So that match was on about maybe a week or two ago, and I was watching it. When I made this comment to Jenny, I was like, I remember watching this match live, and I was so nervous at this moment. And right now, it's so nice because I'm just sitting here like enjoying this match because I'm not worried about, oh, he hits it out here, and it's like, why? Well, it's because I know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. Yeah, he lost that game right there, but I know he's going to come back and win. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about it in a spiritual sense at that point, but as I was reading through this, God kind of brought that to my mind. It was like, just like I was sitting on my couch watching that match, and I was like not encouraged, I was just kind of at rest, knowing what's going to happen. The same within our life, we know what's going to happen, and we can rest in this. And so we know that we're going to have, the faithful servants will coexist with evil to the end of the judgment. And, that's okay. We know what's going to happen, and God and Christ is obviously sharing this. And so just rest in that. This isn't, we hear a lot of sermons about this world is not our home and all these different things, and they're so true. And Jesus again points that out here. And so don't get so up in arms about every little thing that's happening or the evil seems to winning and do our best, obviously, and it's not a license just to sit back and do nothing, but rest and have joy in Christ and knowing we know the final score and how this is going to end. And so anyway, but in the end, so he ends up sharing, in the end, the wheat and the tares grow together, but when the two are separated, the tares are burned and the wheat is gathered into the farmer's barn. One cool thing that he says here is he says, my barn, which is cool. He says it in verse 30. First gather the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. And the commentary said that knows that Jesus was careful to put into the farmer's mouth my barn rather than the barn. And Jesus right here was hinting at the personal possessiveness the Lord has for us, for his faithful. That it's not just, hey, put the wheat into the barn. It was to put the wheat into my barn. And so that's just kind of a cool. So the faithful must coexist with evil until judgment. So the first thing we learned about the kingdom is for listeners only, for those who listen and hear and understand the truth and accept the truth. Second thing is the kingdom, the faithful must coexist with evil until judgment. So what about you? Do you feel like you live a joyful life? Do you feel you have joy resting in God's promises? Or do you feel anxious all the time? And, now's a great time to reflect on that. And there's a lot of things in this world that are kind of going on now, and I think there's a tendency to be a little anxious and be questioning God. But, at this point, this is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, this is where you're tested. Are you really trusting in God even when now things may be topsy-turvy? Or are you only resting in God when things seem perfect? And honestly, a lot of us don't even rest in God and are anxious when everything's fine. There's nothing even going on and we're still anxious. So God does not want us to continuously live this anxious life. Like we're always wondering, we're always worried, we're always upset about this and that. No, you need to rest and have joy resting in God's promises. And, God gives that to him here. So let's look at the next parable, the kingdom surprising impact, okay? The kingdom surprising impact. And this starts in verse 31. So the mustard seed. He presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took, sowed in his field, and this is smaller than all the other seeds. But when it was full grown, it is larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And we'll just continue the other one. The leaven. He spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. All these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and he did not speak to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things since the foundation of the world. That was actually in Psalms, one of the Psalms. And I love these parables as well. While God's kingdom appears to start small, almost invisible, we can take hope in the assurance that it is growing and will achieve its promised glory. And we can just take hope in this. The kingdom, like a mustard seed, okay, the mustard seed was the smallest seed, ends up becoming the largest tree. The leaven, we understand the process of leaven. He puts it into the flour, and the leaven ends up making such a massive impact. But it starts small. The kingdom is this way, okay? And we can be encouraged in that. The kingdom will go through internal, unseen, spiritual dynamic. Jesus was helping the faithful see that outward appearances account for very little. Very, very little. And how often do we get absolutely sucked into outward appearances all the time? In contrast, the power of God, who chooses to work through humble instruments, often in ways that are not obvious, will bring about the glorious influence of the kingdom. This is awesome stuff. Absolutely awesome. So maybe, where are you at in this? Wherever you're serving God, wherever your ministry is, maybe it seems small. Maybe it doesn't seem as impactful as you want it to be. God is using you. God is using your ministry to impact the kingdom. And we got to rest in that. It may seem small. It may seem like a mustard seed. It may seem like a little leaven. Rest and trust that God is using your abilities and your heart. Serve with the right heart attitude. Serve with the right heart motives. Because obviously, earlier in Matthew, Christ talks about if you serve with the wrong motives, there's your reward. So we get that. He's already given us that. Serve with the right heart motives. Serve with understanding that God is using this, and you don't even know how he's using it. You can't see it. It's unseen in a lot of ways. But again, it's something we can rest in. We don't have to overthink it. The kingdom, there's a lot of surprising impact in the kingdom, and that's something we can rest in this morning. The next one, the kingdom's surprising value. So he keeps going on. He ends up explaining the tares and the wheat in verse 36 through 43. He explains that, before we get to the other one, we'll jump into that. He actually leaves the crowd and goes into a house, and most commentators think it was Peter's house. He leaves the crowds and went to the house, and the disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the tares and the field." So then he explains, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. So he says, I am, that's me. And the field is the world. And as for the good seeds, these are the sons of the kingdom. And the tares are the sons of the evil one. So that's where we would be, if you were a son of the kingdom, you would be considered that wheat, okay, the good seed. And the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. So he calls it out, the devil. And the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall be the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And again, he uses the phrase, he who has ears, let him hear. All right, so then he goes on to hidden treasure. He goes on to the hidden treasure. The kingdom of heaven, verse 44, kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and brought it. So the kingdom, what have we learned? The kingdom is for listeners only. Those who have ears, let him hear and understand. Listeners only. The kingdom, we've learned that the faithful must coexist with evil until the judgment. The kingdom's surprising impact, and now the kingdom's surprising value, okay? So despite its appearance to the human eyes, and maybe at that time, the thought of a spiritual kingdom wasn't that enticing, despite its appearance to the human eyes, the kingdom is well worth the investment of a person's life. These parables answer these two closely related questions. Why should we give our lives for the kingdom? And the other question is, can the kingdom truly be the answer to our search for ultimate fulfillment? And you could almost see people thinking and asking these questions in their heart. Why should we give our lives for a kingdom I can't see? And the point of these parables is to show the incredible value of the kingdom. These two individuals basically did all they could do to get this treasure, and it was the most valuable thing in their life. And we can again rest in that. If you're a true believer, you truly accept it, and you truly understand, you have the most valuable thing that you could have. You have Christ, and you're a part of his kingdom. You are the wheat. You are these things that are, and you can rest in, you can trust in, you can hope in it. And, again, these things point to show the incredible value and amazing thing that you have. And the world doesn't have it. They're searching. They're constantly searching for something to fulfill it with. They don't have what we have. But we pray that they can find it, and obviously we would share the truth with them. But Christians should be the most joyful, peaceful, at peace people in the world. And sadly, that's not the case sometimes. A lot of times. They're just as anxious, they're just as worried about all the little stupid things in life that everyone else is worried with. And that shouldn't be the case. So, let's wrap this up. A few applications. One, amazing. We are so privileged with such insight into God's truth. But we must be aware of a resistant heart. Even us now can hear truth of God's word and just not. I don't want that truth. That can be for a variety of reasons: sin, pride, self-centeredness, worried, anxiousness. We must take hold of every truth, and we're so privileged with insight into of God's truth. So that's one application for us. Another main one, and we've talked about a lot, is just trust God genuinely. Genuinely. Trust God genuinely, and avoid Satan's temptations to disbelieve. This one is tough because, in business, in a lot of things in life, people have people say you're playing the long game, playing the short game. Okay. If I relate it to my business in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do is play the long game. The long game's not easy, and a lot of times when you're trying to build something, you're making decisions that the return on that investment may be a long time down the road. But it's harder. It takes a little more maybe discipline at times, whereas honestly my personality is to play the short game a lot. I like to maybe grab that quick return there, what I think would be a quick return. And it's harder for me to try to play the long game in business or in whatever we do. And we have these conversations a lot. I have these conversations with my partner a lot of what we're trying to implement now and when we may see the impact of it. And, humanly speaking, our lives we think is long. It's a long game, but that's what we have to remember. Sometimes I feel like in our Christian life, we like convince our minds that we're going to see all this change. We saw all these things happen in a short amount of time. And then when it's not happening, we can get discouraged and we can get down. And and I don't know if this makes any sense to any of you out there. It makes sense to me is I tell myself I'm playing the long game of my faith. I'm trusting God genuinely, and I'm just trusting His promises. And that doesn't mean I don't come back to them pretty regularly and reminding myself. And that's why being in church is so important, and being around the Word is so important, because I'm constantly being reminded of God's truth, and I'm being encouraged in it, and I'm being yes, and that's what we need. Just like if you're running a business, you want to see signs of, we're making the right decision here. We're making this, even if the return on it is not for a long time. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but in my faith, play the long game, not the short game. You're not going to see, so many of these saints of ages past didn't see all these things. And Christ kind of alludes to that in this chapter with his disciples. He's saying, you're able to see things that many people wanted to see and never got to see. Remember, trust God genuinely. Take hope in the promises of God's Word. Whether or not we see them all the way to the end of this life, we'll see them in our next life, obviously. Another application is do not be discouraged about seemingly small contributions to the kingdom. God is using all to build towards His ultimate glorious kingdom. And I would say what you deem as small contributions, that I don't believe any contribution is small towards the kingdom, but in our own minds we may think, this isn't really doing much. But God is using it, and that's the key. God. It's not you making something happen. It's you just serving God faithfully with the right heart motive. God can use it in big ways. We're challenged to trust the King enough to yield to Him everything. And this investment will pay rich dividends. Yield to Christ everything. Don't be discouraged in this life, in the long game. Like we said, live joyfully, rest in these promises. And that's the biggest thing I can say to myself, to you, is live joyfully, resting in God's promises. And we have so much to be thankful for. We're such privileged to understand, to hear the truth. God has opened up our eyes to understand and hear the truth. And I just pray that you can rest in that this morning and take courage from these parables in Matthew 13.